The heavy oak doors of Hawthorne Hall swung open with a slow creak, letting in a flood of crisp autumn air and a tide of chattering students. It was late afternoon at Harvard, but the campus still pulsed with life. Bicycles clicked past the ivy-draped windows, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a street cart drifted in, and somewhere in the distance the bells of Memorial Church tolled 4 measured notes. Inside the lecture hall, a sense of anticipation thickened the atmosphere like the low hum before a thunderstorm. Students streamed to their seats in waves, notebooks under their arms and laptops glowing like fireflies as they settled into the wooden benches. This wasn't an ordinary class. It was Professor Whitmore's famed Mathematical Paradoxes and Elegant Proofs, a course so legendary that students camped online for enrollment the second the registration portal opened. Those who secured a spot wore it like a badge of honor. Whitmore was known not just for his brilliance but for his love of intellectual theater. He delighted in tossing riddles at his students like flaming torches to see who dared to catch them. Today promised something extraordinary. A rumor had circulated all week. The professor was planning to unveil a problem that had haunted mathematicians for decades, a riddle that defied conventional logic and remained unsolved despite the attempts of seasoned scholars. By the time the clock in the hall ticked toward 4 p.m., every seat was filled. Even the aisles were lined with graduate students perched cross-legged on the floor, craning their necks for a glimpse of the chalkboard. Professor Whitmore entered not with a grand flourish but with the quiet confidence of a man who knew the room already belonged to him. Tall and slightly stooped, with silver-flecked hair that caught the light like spun glass, he carried nothing but a piece of chalk between his fingers. The moment he reached the podium, the buzz died into a reverent hush. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a measured baritone that carried effortlessly to the farthest row, "today we will attempt something audacious. We will wrestle with a question that has humbled even the greatest minds of our era." He turned to the blackboard and, with a swift, practiced motion, began to write. The chalk squeaked across the slate in a series of symbols and notations so intricate they resembled a foreign language. At first, the students leaned forward eagerly, pencils racing to capture each character. But as the equation stretched across the board, spilling from one panel to the next, looping into elegant but bewildering patterns, frowns began to furrow. Whitmore stepped aside to reveal the full scope, an imposing tapestry of variables, limits, and conditional statements. "The challenge," he said, tapping the final symbol, "is not merely to manipulate these expressions. It is to find the underlying principle that makes them whole. Solve this, and you will have touched a mystery that has defied solution for over 50 years. A ripple of excitement and anxiety swept the hall. The brightest students, those who had breezed through quantum mechanics and abstract algebra, glanced at one another, eyes alight with a competitive spark. Laptops opened with a flurry of keystrokes. Notebooks filled with hurried calculations. For the first 30 minutes, the room buzzed like a beehive. Equations formed and dissolved on paper. Whispered debates rose and fell. Try a Fourier transform. No, think non-Euclidean geometry. What if it's a trick question? Every few minutes, someone would stand, stride to the board, and attempt a bold manipulation of the symbols, only to pause, hesitate, and retreat when their reasoning collapsed under its own weight. By the hour mark, the atmosphere had changed. The early bravado gave way to furrowed brows and bitten lips. Sweat beaded on foreheads despite the crisp autumn air that seeped through the old windows. Pages of notes accumulated like fallen leaves, each one dense with crossed-out calculations and arrows pointing to dead ends. The brightest minds on campus, future tech entrepreneurs, Rhodes scholars, the scions of influential families, began to realize that the problem was not merely difficult, it was merciless. Professor Whitmore watched in silence, arms folded, his face unreadable. Occasionally he walked among the rows, glancing at students' work with a slight tilt of his head, offering neither encouragement nor correction. The ticking of the massive wall clock grew louder, each second a sharp reminder of the passing time. The turning point came around the 90-minute mark. A senior named Derek, known for winning international math competitions, stood abruptly and approached the board with the energy of someone who had found a breakthrough. He filled half a panel with complex substitutions and clever manipulations, the chalk flying so fast it left a misty trail. The room held its breath. But then he stopped. His shoulders sagged as he realized that his elegant path looped back to the original equation, unchanged. With a frustrated grunt, he capped the chalk and slumped back to his seat. A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. One by one, other heavyweights followed a similar pattern, bold attempts ending in quiet defeat. By the 2-hour mark, the beehive buzz had faded into a heavy stillness. Pens stopped moving. The once frantic clacking of keyboards ceased. Some students leaned back, rubbing their temples, others stared blankly at the chalkboard as if sheer will might bend it to their understanding. It was a rare sight at Harvard, the best and brightest collectively humbled. These were students accustomed to success, to problems that yielded to persistence. Yet here they sat, the challenge unbroken, their confidence fraying with each passing minute. A few exchanged resigned glances, silently conceding what none wanted to say aloud, that they had met a wall they could not climb. Professor Whitmore finally stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the hall. "Has anyone," he asked softly, "found a path worth sharing?" Silence answered. Not a single hand rose among the dozens of students who usually clamored to impress. The room felt almost sacred in its quiet, the kind of silence that follows a revelation or a loss. The chalkboard loomed like a monument to human limitation, its symbols glowing faintly in the late daylight. Near the back of the hall, a young woman shifted in her seat. She had been watching and listening, her dark eyes tracking every attempt, every failure. Her name was Amina, a scholarship student, largely invisible in this sea of privilege. But for now, she remained still, waiting as the rest of the room finally lowered their eyes in reluctant surrender. The hush in the lecture hall stretched on, long enough that the sound of the wall clock ticking began to feel almost intrusive. Professor Whitmore's gaze traveled slowly across the room. He didn't look disappointed, if anything, his eyes held a flicker of curiosity, as if he were waiting for a surprise. But no one moved. In the back row, Amina felt the weight of that silence like a stone on her chest. She had spent the last 2 hours absorbing every stroke of chalk, every aborted attempt, every whispered theory. While others scribbled furiously, she had watched, listened, and let the symbols sink into her mind like water through soil. The equations' loops and turns had begun to reveal faint echoes of patterns she'd seen before, snatches of symmetry in her grandmother's woven textiles, rhythms she'd tapped out on the grocery store counter while waiting for customers. Amina was not the kind of student people noticed at first glance. Her black curls were pulled into a practical bun, and her sweatshirt bore the faint logo of the Boston Public Library where she'd spent countless afternoons tutoring middle schoolers to make ends meet. She was in her second year at Harvard on a full scholarship, a triumph that had required a relentless schedule of part-time jobs and late-night study sessions. Her classmates came from families with vacation homes and prep school pedigrees. She came from a small apartment in Roxbury where her mother worked double shifts as a nurse and still found time to remind her daughter that brilliance isn't owned by the wealthy. As she sat there, Amina heard her mother's voice in memory, "You belong in every room you step into." She had repeated those words on the night Amina received her acceptance letter, her hands trembling with pride. Amina had carried them with her through every intimidating lecture, every subtle dismissal, every moment when she'd felt like an outsider in halls lined with portraits of men whose lives had been paved long before they were born. Now, those words pulsed in her ears as she stared at the chalkboard. The problem wasn't impossible. It was just different. Everyone else had attacked it head-on, trying to bend it to known methods, but Amina sensed that it required something more fluid, a willingness to dance with its contradictions instead of conquering them. Professor Whitmore broke the silence. "No one." His tone wasn't mocking, just gently probing. "Are we content to let the mystery stand?" Amina's heart pounded. Her palms felt slick against her notebook. She thought of staying quiet, of letting the moment pass. Who was she to think she could do what these celebrated prodigies could not? She glanced at the students around her, future hedge fund managers, startup founders, international math Olympians. They exuded the quiet confidence of people born into expectation. Then she thought of the nights she'd stayed up past midnight stalking. Amina's chair scraped lightly against the wooden floor as she rose. The faint sound seemed to echo through the silent hall, turning dozens of heads at once. Conversations stopped mid-breath. A few eyebrows arched in surprise, others barely concealed their skepticism. The quiet figure from the back, someone many classmates barely knew by name, was the one daring to move when the brightest minds had already conceded defeat. Her steps toward the front felt strangely deliberate, as if each footfall carried the weight of her journey to this room, The late-night bus rides home from her tutoring job, the relentless balancing of coursework and work shifts, the constant internal battle against the small voice that sometimes whispered she didn't belong here. With every step, she heard her mother's words like a heartbeat, "You belong in every room you step into." Professor Whitmore watched her approach with a calm, almost imperceptible smile, as if he had been expecting someone exactly like her to stand up. He offered the chalk without a word. It was cool and dry in her fingers, slightly dusty, the kind of texture she associated with possibility. Amina turned to the board, letting her eyes trace the tangle of symbols. Where others had seen chaos, she saw a subtle rhythm, a hidden cadence, like a syncopated beat in a jazz composition. She took a deep breath, lifted the chalk, and began to write. At first her strokes were small and careful, almost hesitant. But soon her hand moved with growing confidence, sweeping across the blackboard in confident arcs. She began not by attacking the equation directly, but by reframing it, grouping terms, highlighting symmetrical fragments that most had overlooked. A soft murmur rippled through the room. Students leaned forward. Laptops that had been snapped shut flicked open again. A few exchanged quick, puzzled glances as they recognized something familiar in her approach. Yet she was doing it in a way they had never quite considered. She spoke sparingly, her voice steady but low, explaining each transformation with precise clarity, how certain pairs of terms mirrored each other, how a hidden sequence emerged when viewed through a different axis, how what looked like contradictions were in fact elegant complements. The chalk squeaked in quick, confident bursts as she carved a path through the mathematical labyrinth. Minutes stretched into an almost dreamlike quiet. Even the sound of the wall clock seemed to fade. The only noise was the steady rhythm of chalk and the occasional soft intake of breath from students who realized, one step at a time, where she was heading. When she finally placed the chalk down, a complete solution unfurled across the board like a piece of abstract art, balanced, clear, and undeniable. For a heartbeat the hall remained perfectly silent, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Then the reaction came like a sudden summer storm. It started with a single gasp, then a low murmur of astonishment, and finally an eruption of applause so loud it rattled the window panes. Students leapt to their feet almost involuntarily, clapping, some even cheering. The sound filled the vaulted room, a roar of collective awe and respect. Amina stepped back, her pulse racing. The applause washed over her in a surreal wave, but she kept her composure. Professor Whitmore approached, his eyes shining with something between admiration and quiet pride. He examined the board for a long moment, tracing the solution with his gaze. "Elegant," he said at last, his voice carrying to the farthest row. "Utterly elegant. You have not only solved it, you've illuminated it." The applause swelled again. Several classmates who had barely glanced her way before now looked at her with open respect, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine admiration. A few students who had confidently taken the first stabs at the problem gave small, rueful smiles and even nods of acknowledgement. Amina felt a rush of emotions, relief, exhilaration, and a quiet, grounded pride. She hadn't come to outshine anyone. She had simply followed the path she saw, the pattern that had whispered to her all along. After class, students gathered around her, peppering her with questions. "How did you see that? What made you group those terms that way?" She answered patiently, describing how she had recognized a hidden sequence and resisted the urge to force familiar methods onto something unfamiliar. Professor Whitmore approached once more, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Remember this moment," he said softly, so only she could hear. "Not because you solved it, but because you trusted your own insight. That's the true mark of a mathematician." Outside, the late afternoon light had deepened into a golden dusk. Amina stepped onto the stone steps of Hawthorne Hall, the crisp autumn air filling her lungs. The cheers and applause still echoed faintly in her ears, but what stayed with her most was the quiet knowledge that she had claimed her space, not through bravado or competition, but through clarity, patience, and the courage to raise her hand when everyone else stayed still. Word of the feat spread quickly across campus. By evening, messages lit up group chats and campus forums. "Did you hear about the girl who cracked Whitmore's riddle?" Her name became a whispered legend among first years and grad students alike. Some retold it as a story of sheer genius, others as a parable of perseverance and the importance of fresh eyes. For Amina, it wasn't about legend. It was about something simpler and deeper, proof to herself that brilliance isn't limited by privilege or pedigree. She thought of her mother back in Roxbury, likely finishing another long shift at the hospital. She imagined telling her what had happened, that in a room where everyone else gave up, she had stood up and found a way through. That night, as she sat at her small desk under the warm glow of a thrift store lamp, she replayed the moment when she decided to raise her hand. The fear, the heartbeat in her ears, the quiet resolve. She smiled to herself, understanding now that the greatest challenge had not been the equation on the board, but the silent question within, do I belong here? And she had answered it, unmistakably, indelibly, yes.